This is Building Up, brought to you by Watt, Teeter, Hoffer and Fitzgerald and the Vertex Companies, where you get insights from industry experts, reviewing topics construction professionals deal with on a daily basis, observations on new developments within the industry, and practical guidance from Vertex's experts and the attorneys at Watt, Teeter to help your business thrive in the construction industry.
Hey, Brian.
Hey, Jeff.
What do we got on the docket for today?
Well, today we're going to be talking about schedules. I think it's such an important concept throughout the industry. And again, I think a lot of people just don't have a whole lot of knowledge about it. And I think we have three great guests here to talk about that today.
Yeah, it's always, almost always a requirement on any construction project to have a schedule. It's sometimes thrown out there as just, something that people handle as a checklist. But these schedules are always, part of some of the biggest claims we deal with in construction, which are delay claims. So they're immensely important. Our three guests today, Hendrik Prinsloo with Vertex, Andrew Sargent with Vertex, and Amanda Marutzky with Watt, Teeter, all have immense experience dealing with schedules, ranging from schedule generation, schedule maintenance, analyzing schedules, and analyzing delays, and kind of how they incorporate into contracts, notices, all these things that roll together, and why they're so important, because they really, truly are. And I'm excited to get to talk with each other, with these guests, about a topic that I'm personally passionate about and deal with almost every day in my career. So, Brian, without further ado, you ready to get started?
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
Dr. Prinsloo, we're going to start with you. Why is scheduling so important from a project management and planning perspective, and who should be involved in the scheduling process?
Jeff, as you said in your introduction, I think scheduling is a project management tool. I think project planning is not new. If we think back of ancient projects like the pyramids, the Great Wall of China, and so forth, they all had to have some form of planning or scheduling. Now, it's really interesting. Researchers have looked and studied these projects, but I think the earliest evidence of formal project scheduling and planning was found in the early 20th century. And I think that happened in Poland with the development of a harmony graph. Now, back more to recent times, I think the scheduling as we know it today, the main technique, the critical path method, was developed in the 1950s. And I think it's commonly utilized. And I think the second part of the question was who should be involved. Now, because scheduling is part of your planning process, I think all project participants should be involved in planning. So the more people you involve, the better. And we'll talk a little bit later maybe about differences in planning. How do you approach it? But I think it's such a core component of any project and also to the success of a project.
So how do you think that a contractor or a subcontractor should integrate their project participants? I mean, should they be bringing them in for a baseline schedule preparation session? Should they be bringing them in for monthly reviews of the schedule? How frequently should they be working with these people involved in the project?
Jeff, great question. I think the essence of that, and it's a concept that we see more and more in the construction industry, and it's based on some of the lean construction principles. It is called pool scheduling, and I think traditionally what happened if you do scheduling was that you would have a specialized person that's maybe a planner or a scheduler that would sit and have knowledge of software like P6, for example, and they with certain input would develop a schedule. I think the downside of that is that many times the project participants and the people who execute the work really doesn't feel part of the process, and it's more almost of a top-down process. Now, pool scheduling on the other side is where the general contractor would maybe get all the project participants, the subcontractors together in one room, and they would plan the project, and everybody would have some inputs to make, and ultimately that planning would end up in the schedule. And I think that's such a good way to do planning, because you get, I think, the benefit of the information that certain subcontractors would have on their specialist field, and also the integration and the interaction between different project participants. So we hope that that's something that we will see more in the future. And I think that I would say is sort of the future where we should aim at in terms of creating a more collaborative environment when doing planning.
So for the pool scheduling, I know you mentioned that that's kind of what you would rather see. Is that something, obviously it happens at the start of the project. Is that something that, kind of is an ever, continuous process that these parties, collaborate for the scheduling?
Yeah, I think the first prize would be to have it a continuous process. And I think, as many of us know, is that construction is all about changes, and many things change. So in many occasions you have to replan. And I think if you come at a stage that you need to replan, it would be good to have a session like that again. I think it's typically done in the beginning of the project when you do your initial schedule. But definitely, I think it's always a good idea, and planning is a thing that never stops. So you should plan throughout your project.
So I definitely do want to come back to pool planning a little bit later, but in your answer, you mentioned P6 as a scheduling software. Andrew, you're a planning and scheduling professional. And what are some of the common scheduling software packages that are utilized today? And why is it important for a contractor or subcontractor to care either what software they have in-house, what software the project is using? Why is that important?
So you mentioned P6. That's definitely the dominant offering on complex projects, larger projects. Most sophisticated GCs are using P6 on their projects. With more straightforward, less sophisticated projects, you can get by with Microsoft Project. It's a little bit more limited, not as technical. It is easier to use, but it has some drawbacks. A lot of contractors do use that still, but there's definitely benefits to P6 when you get into more intricate and complicated projects with a lot of relationships.
I'll chime in there. So, Andrew, is it often the owner that dictates what type of software the general or the subcontractor are allowed to use, or is that something that the subcontractor can decide on his own?
So we do see it specified a lot of times that you have to use P6. Every once in a while, there are alternatives to P6. There's Ask the Power Project, which I've seen specified a couple times, but we do see the software package specified, but not, I'd say it's 25% of the time. Otherwise, it's technically up to you as long as you're able to use a package that meets all the specified requirements.
And I think that that's probably one of the things, like, we're seeing more detailed scheduling specifications nowadays. And some of the softwares may not have the ability to do some of the things as easily as P6 would do, such as a changes report generated between successive updates. Just these are kind of things that I think you could kind of run print offs of different view templates and viewpoints. So I think that those scheduling specifications are going to be really important.
No, that's a good point. The federal government did revise their standard spec in 2015, actually, and the standard language does require P6. So that kind of gives you a sense of where some of the bigger contracting agencies are with scheduling software.
Now that we're talking about specifications, which is kind of, as an attorney, what we always are looking at in the contract language and provisions, this is for Amanda. We've been seeing contracts include much greater detail with respect to both technical scheduling requirements, such as restrictions on activity duration, leads and lags, other scheduling practices, just what Andrew just discussed, as to specifications as to the software to be used. When it comes down to the significance of the project schedule as it relates to potential damages exposure, what contract provisions, should contractors be cognizant of?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, to your point that we're seeing greater detail in our contracts as it relates to scheduling, I think that's a good thing. As attorneys, we want to be as detailed as possible because our job is to anticipate the problem ahead of time, right? And so to the extent that any disputes come down the line later, if whatever situation arises with that dispute is already addressed in the contract, it's very helpful. But as far as what specific provisions you want to be aware of or look at, the typical ones to read or to look out for would be a no damages for delay clause, a waiver of consequential damages, anything that says time is of the essence. I'm going to do a quick plug for Watt Teeter here because on our website, Watt Teeter has what's called our 50 state survey. And on there, what we've done is we've looked at every single state in the United States and looked up the law on the enforceability of specifically the no damages for delay clause and the enforceability of the waiver of consequential damages clause in that particular jurisdiction. That's a really useful tool. Say you're litigating something in Oklahoma and you don't know what the courts in Oklahoma say about whether or not you can waive consequential damages. You can go look at our 50 state survey. It's pretty helpful. Those are the two big ones. Like I said, time is of the essence. And then obviously any completion deadlines, any milestone deadlines that you need to meet, and then related liquidated damages clauses. If you have a $5,000 a day liquidated damages clause, if you don't meet your completion deadline, you need to be aware of that. That's important to take note of before you start your project. And then in general, just any notice provisions. So anything that requires you to give notice of an impact, a delay within a certain time frame of your being aware of it. You need to have that ready and tracked and organized before you start your job.
I mean, that notice provisions obviously are extremely helpful for us too, right, as consultants. And when, we're trying to piece these stories together about when an issue came to light, when it may have continued through and ended, the impact or the delay. So Hendrik, with that kind of in mind, what do you think a contractor or subcontractor can do with its operations and especially within its schedule to improve its operations, to improve its production, and to make sure that it's tracking and preserving and pursuing claims?
Jeff, if you look at the form contracts, I think over the years, the form contracts stayed away from a prescriptive way of dealing with schedules. So there's sort of almost general schedule requirements. So if you're a subcontractor or a general contractor, I think you needed to do a little bit more compared to what the contract would specify. And I think the reason is, as we mentioned earlier, I think your schedule is really your tool for the management, monitoring, and planning on your project. So the more detail you have, the better. And I think the more you update your project, the better. I think we see sometimes that some contracts would require monthly schedule updates, and I think that's always a good practice to do, because I think then at least you know what the state of play is. It should show you if you're behind on critical activities and where you should focus your resource. So I think the priority for any contractor should be to really use the schedule as a management tool and not only as a device to monitor progress.
Now, is there such a thing as too much detail in schedules?
That's an idea that's subject to debate amongst different people. I'm of the opinion that more detail the better in nearly every sense, but a lot of people disagree and think keeping it at a higher level can benefit you in certain situations. At a minimum, you obviously need to make sure you're abiding by the contract. So all the rules that are listed need to be followed. That's kind of rule number one with level of detail. The second principle that I think definitely needs to be applied in all scenarios is delineation of responsibility. So every activity you include can be assigned to one single subcontractor, vendor, one party. So if it's delayed later on, or there's an issue, something happens, you know exactly who to point to. If it's blended, it's a little less clear on who's at fault when you're doing a delay analysis later on. Completeness is another big thing. You got to make sure you have everything in there. So make sure your level of detail is to a point that, every testing activity is listed, not just one testing activity at the end of the project. You need to really make sure all the detail is there so you can properly model the work.
Andrew, I think you mentioned a number of really valid points, and I think it's schedule, sometimes it depends on who is utilizing the schedule. And I think especially if you're utilizing the schedule as a management tool on your construction site, I think the more detail, the better, because that's activities that you need to execute on a day-to-day basis. It might be that you use a schedule to report to the owner group. And I think in cases like that, you don't want that level of detail because you just simply want to convey sort of maybe the status of progress. And then I think on the other hand, if we normally get involved on a more forensic schedule analysis or delay analysis perspective, I think in that occasions, it's also preferable to have more detail compared to less. So I think the purpose of the schedule is also an important question to ask, but I think indeed if you use it as a management tool, I think rather more detail than less detail.
No, that's a great point. I just think the one other thing to remember is that the schedule at the end of the day is a model for the project. So the more input you put in, the more reliable the model is, more robust it is, and the better it reflects the actual project you're building out there.
Yeah, I would certainly echo that, right? You don't want to have activities that cover such a broad area on the project where if something happens in a very limited location, your schedule isn't modeling that the entire project is completely upside down without you chopping it up into, more activities. So I think to your point about completeness, Andrew, having that, complete schedule from the onset is important versus having to add dozens of activities in each progressive update and making, a job for someone who's doing a forensic analysis later even more difficult. I mean, this is, this schedule, job cost reports, project controls, like all of these things about how a project is initially set up are all effort that sometimes gets a little hustled or, rushed. Whereas if it's really focused on thus at the beginning of the job, it's going to pay dividends as you progress through the job. And if you end up in a situation where you do have delays, you need to allocate those delays or pursue a claim maybe against an owner or another party. One thing, earlier, Hendrik, you mentioned pull planning. I like pull planning. I enjoy it. I like the fact that it does get everyone in the same room. It sets goals. It's very tactile, right? You're going up to a board and you're pulling off Post-it notes and writing what you're supposed to do. And you can see what got done or what didn't get done over the week. But an issue that I sometimes see with pull planning is that it becomes a totally independent exercise from what could be a monthly schedule update or a weekly schedule update, where it doesn't get tied back into, say, the schedule that goes to the owner. And now you've got these potentially two competing schedules and what was being used, what can be used for delay analysis. How do you think that project team needs to balance this idea of a, modeled project schedule versus a field level schedule?
Jeff, I think that's critical too, and we see it so many times that you get a schedule, but if you really investigate what happened, it's clear that the schedule was not really followed in the execution of the work. So I think it's critical that that there should only be one schedule. That schedule should be used as your execution tool and as your monitoring tool. I think for a number of reasons. I think one of the reasons might be if there's ever issues in terms of looking at the delays, it becomes so difficult if you sit with a schedule and it doesn't tell the true story of how the work was executed. So I think in a pool planning scenario, I think the step to take that information, incorporate it into the overall schedule is critical and something that needs to be done. And I think we've all seen sort of the nightmare scenarios if you have a schedule that's not updated throughout the project, and to then look back retrospectively and try to really establish what happened.
So, Amanda, I know you've mentioned to me in the past that one of the challenges you face is consultants come in, they get a production of files, and there's just schedules with the same dates, schedules that, different types of schedules. And so you see this a lot where there's just multiple levels of schedules being produced, and it's not clear which one is really the one prevailing over the project, correct?
Yeah. So, Hendrik, you mentioned the nightmare scenario. And I think a lot of times as attorneys, we are kind of coming in on the back end after everything's already been done, right? And what I've seen in the past is maybe we have multiple schedules of the schedule of what actually happened on the job, and then the schedule that might have been submitted just because they were trying to check a box on the contract to turn it in. But those schedules don't necessarily line up. And so I'm trying to help my client. My consultant is trying to help our client prove up a delay or a time impact, and we don't know which schedule was actually used. I think the key is something you said earlier, which is how do you view the schedule? Are you viewing it as something that is just kind of a contractual requirement that you're just checking a box and submitting it, or are you actually using it to manage and plan what you're doing on the job? And if it's the latter, if you really are using your schedule to drive your work and referencing it and just using one schedule and not multiple, it'll serve you better at the end, because then you do have kind of cleaner evidence to support your claims.
Amanda, I think this goes back to the point that you mentioned in the beginning. I think if you look at the contracts, I think typically the contracts would not be so prescriptive in terms of scheduling throughout the project. So it would basically ask the contractor to initially submit a first schedule that should be accepted by the owner group. But I think it's seldom that you see sort of prescriptions in terms of regular updates for schedules. And I think it's definitely something that we hopefully would see more in the future, a little bit more detail and specific requirements for schedule updates, because I think if you enforce that through the contract, then the contractor needs to put in that additional effort to make sure that either on a monthly basis or another period it's chosen, that really there's effort to look at all the activities assess progress and see how to move forward. So I think besides having a sort of a detail and, as Andrew mentioned, a really complete first or baseline schedule, I think it's important also to keep updated schedule that's a true reflection of how work is progressing and what the next few weeks will look like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of times contractors are, they're focused on getting the job done, right? And they're more action oriented. And so maybe the last thing on their list is to think about updating their schedule. But like you said, it's so important. It can be so useful. And if we can change the culture, the mindset, so that our clients so that contractors can be as proactive as possible, it's like your future self thanks your present self for thinking ahead and anticipating of how it might serve you better to have a detailed schedule now after the fact.
That's something that I think we are always stressing to contractors that we're working with, to have like this claims forward, backwards looking mindset. Where are we going to be if something goes wrong, and how quickly are we going to be able to analyze it? But like having that whole team integrated and making sure that the person who's just doing the schedule is talking to the field people, who are talking to the people who are making decisions about whether they need to, who are signing change orders and things like that. Knowing that you're experiencing a delay, obviously you have to know what's happening for you to submit a time impact analysis, or to make sure that you're not releasing or waiving your rights with respect to a certain impact. So like all these players and all these people, I think, come together at this time, right? Are we really seeing what's happening on the project? Are we really projecting ahead? And also, are we thinking about where we're going to be a week from now, a month from now, at the end of the project, in terms of what we're documenting and what we're preserving, and what we're sometimes also releasing? Andrew, right? We come in all the time, and sometimes we have no P6 files. Sometimes we have no daily reports. Sometimes we don't know which ones are the right ones to use. How do you think?
Sometimes is putting it lightly. But yeah. Sorry, I cut you off. What was your question?
No, from a record keeping perspective, in terms of scheduling, what do you think is some good practices for a contractor who's part of the party, either who's actually the one generating and maintaining the schedules, or a subcontractor or a lower tier who's receiving the schedules?
Well, so records are back to what Amanda was saying earlier about kind of changing the culture. People don't really understand the value or see the value in making these efforts to your, document control systems and project controls until you've been hammered by it, right? Till you got hit with a claim, or you couldn't support your own claim, you lost a ton of money. Then you kind of see the benefit. And from a scheduling sense, I think it's definitely important, like Hendrik was saying earlier, do your regular updates at least monthly. Document all your changes as you're going. Any impacts, whether they're critical or not, should be identified, because they can, come back down the road. They may not be critical now, but something the owner did or something a subcontractor did this period could end up being critical much later. So just having something that you can go back and point to and say, look, here's when this happened. Here's when we knew about it and included it in our model of the project. And that ties back also to what Amanda was talking about with the notice provisions. When you have a strict deadline and you're doing these updates regularly, keeping good records, you can abide by that provision pretty easily, because you know when it hits you what the impact's going to be.
And do you have any advice for subcontractors or those people who are receiving these kind of schedule updates?
Subcontractors, the biggest thing is to make sure you're getting the updates, number one. A lot of times we see GCs, just whether it's on purpose or just because they don't think about it, they don't provide the updates to their subs regularly. If you're a sub, request your updates monthly at least, just so you can keep track of where it's projecting your work overall. If it's showing any delays, you can then use those to your advantage. And if you can, get the native files. PDFs are are good, but if you can get the native files, you'll be better off if you have a claim scenario later.
And that's because the native files are showing the underlying logic and all of the things that are happening kind of behind the scenes from just the date perspective, right?
Yeah, I mean, the PDFs have value, but you can't confirm the logic ties. You can make assumptions, but you can't really identify the critical path with 100% certainty with the PDF schedule.
And I think something else that's probably worth mentioning is that just the way that the software works, right? So P6 is a database software. So what does that really mean in terms of having access to these files? And say you've got one technical scheduler in your company. Is someone in the field going to be able to get to those schedules easily, even if they may have P6 on their machine?
Well, there's different versions of P6. Some are integrated across company. Others are just local on each individual's computer. If you have the integrated version, obviously you can access it wherever, check out the file, update it, look at what's happening. But that master is still controlled by the administrator. If you're doing it locally, no, you'll need to request them from whoever's updating the schedule. But again, back to what you were saying about document control, if you're updating these monthly, regularly, whatever interval, and exporting them to some kind of shared drive at your company that everyone has access to, they can then jump on and pull that and see what's going on.
So back to the idea of just having these robust document control measures and how the schedule is this planning tool, but also a record keeping tool, and one that needs to be, preserved and handled as any other document on a file would be.
Yeah, for sure. I think the what one should always keep in mind is if there's ever a dispute, it's always the person with the best records that is in the better position. And I think the schedule is no exception. So if you have up-to-date schedules with supporting documents, you have such a advantage in terms of protecting your entitlement to any additional time you might require as contractor for unexpected delays. So I think that is such a critical thing to keep your documents up to date. And I think as many of us on doing forensic analysis see, the more detail, the better, and that would help you ultimately to analyze and to see what really transpired.
Yeah, and I think that document control concept really goes through all the way until the attorneys get involved too. Having a comprehensive set of the records and details up for the schedule only helps us when we get involved, and we got our trying to prove entitlement to a claim related to whatever it is, delay, productivity.
So from when you get a file, Amanda, or from a claim preservation standpoint, what do you like to see when you open up kind of the contractor's records and say, oh man, what do we need to do here? What's our consultant going to look at? What do you hope to see? What's the best thing that a contractor can do?
I think the first thing I hope to see or know is that my contractor has actually read the notice provisions and is familiar with them. Kind of like we were saying earlier, a lot of times we can be so focused on just the action of building the project. We don't often take the time to read through the general conditions, read through the notice provisions, read any dispute resolution clauses. And it's important. You need to know what the contract says. When you're talking about a delay, does the contract say that you need to give the owner notice as soon as the delay is known or within 5 days of the impact arising? That's a very tight window when you're just focused on building the job. How many times have we seen it where a delay event happens and then 2 weeks go by and then the letter is sent to the owner documenting their notice or their awareness of it? And so I like to see knowledge of the contract, but then obviously compliance with it. And then we discussed earlier trying to not have a lot of different schedules that compete or that might say different things. Another thing that a contractor can do is to have a schedule log that could be a useful tool to kind of eliminate on the back end the confusion about which schedule was actually used to build the project. And so knowledge of the notice provisions, compliance with the notice provisions, a schedule log, and then also just as a last point, making sure that my contractor, our client, hasn't waived any right to time. Sometimes, again, as they're going through and building the project and they just want to get paid, they might sign a pay application or a change order that releases or waives the right to additional time. So being aware of what the language of the pay app or the change order says to make sure you're not waiving anything is super important.
So yeah, just that overall awareness that comes from knowing your documents inside and out and knowing your schedules inside and out and making sure that, there's these checks and balances, right? It's not just one person who manages the schedule, who does everything there, and they're not talking to the other people, or one person who signs the change orders who aren't having in-house counsel or outside counsel look at what they're signing. So yeah, having that, I guess, up and down checks and balances and comprehensive team, which sometimes is hard when you are up against a tight schedule or trying to get something done and having issues on a project.
Something that I have suggested to clients is before they even start the job to have me as their attorney or whoever you have as your counsel look at the contract ahead of time and break out what those notice provisions are, what those requirements are, so that you can then set your deadlines and track it. Sometimes these notice provisions can be hidden in the contract and you might not have time to read all of them. And so that's why having an attorney kind of on retainer is helpful.
Yeah, I think to add to that, I think it's so important to ensure that you comply to the contract. And sometimes it can be time consuming, but I think before you start a project as a contractor, you need to review the contract and all the provisions. And I think it's so helpful if you have a legal specialist that can highlight important provisions for you, also from a procedural point of view. I think the good example is the notification provision. And I think in many contracts, and you see it all much more often now, that provision is included what they call a strict time bar. So it means that if you do not comply with the 10 or 20 days of notification, you would waive your claim to additional time. And I think there's many debates on it, and contractors might say, well, that's really unfair because we were still delayed. But I think if you look at the writers of form contracts, the reasons why that clause is maybe so strict is because it's a risk management tool. So if you produce notice, you share the risk almost, and you allow the owner the ability to act. But I think if it's something that is not known to the owner, you'd almost take away that ability of the owner to do something. So I think the provisions is so important. And I think the construction contracts over development over the years, I think it's used also to enhance management and to ultimately, I think we're all in it together to ultimately complete the project in time. And I think that's why it's so important to follow the provisions in the contract.
No, that's a great point, Hendrik. Amanda, what you were saying earlier about having someone look at the contract at the beginning, I think that, that's something we're talking about, bettering your overall procedures. I think that's a great idea just because, if you, on all your projects, if you miss out on a claim one time on one of the projects, it could be very, very costly. So I think that would be money well spent, having somebody come in, making sure your team is aware of what their obligations are to prevent such a scenario.
Yeah, and if you think about it, it's not that much of an investment for you as a contractor. You say you bid a job, you get awarded the project, you get a notice to proceed, you send all of your contract documents to your project lawyer, and it doesn't take too much time for them, maybe a day or two at most, to go through and outline the important dates, the important provisions for you, and shoot it back to you. A very small investment for a very big payoff at the end of the project.
Yeah, I think it goes along to, again, that idea I think Andrew mentioned it. It's really realizing the value of taking these proactive steps at, before disputes come up. Again, whether it's sending the contract documents to an attorney to, go over and, break out the notice provisions and compliance requirements. Or again, whether it's taking the steps to really build out that schedule and keep managing it and using it as a tool for managing the project throughout the entirety of the project. I think taking those proactive steps and realizing the value that adds during the project in the long run will lead to hopefully, less delays, less inefficiencies, those types of things.
And it sounds so obvious, I think, that you should be checking your contract, but I understand where some contractors are coming from. They do repeat work with an agency or with a contractor all the time, and they think the contract is going to be exactly the same. But of course, these things are, adapted documents. Decisions and new court rulings and new case law are going to change the way that these contracts are written. And then, you make the mistake of not reading it. And even if you read it 3 projects ago, it could be different now. So I think it's definitely not safe to assume what the contract says, but to always have that due diligence in reviewing it. We've talked a lot about the planning part of the schedule process and about contractual provisions. When we get to the point where we're actually in claim or preparing an analysis, Hendrik, how do the quality of the schedules, the frequency of the updates, all these other characteristics that we've discussed, how do they play into the type of methodology that you're going to deploy or the type of analysis that you're going to undertake?
We have, I think, typically there's 5 sort of popular schedule analysis methods. Now, the choice of the methods mostly is determined by the schedule information at hand. So, and I think the many methods would rely on monthly updates. Other methods would rely on having a good initial or baseline schedule. Other methods, again, would need a as-built schedule that reflects the actual activity durations of activities in your schedule. So I think if you have really good schedule information, it's so much easier for the lay analysts to make a choice to use the best methods. The less information you have, I think then it becomes really restrictive. So I think, again, we're almost saying the same thing, is that it's always a good idea to keep your schedules up to date. And I think another important point is your ultimate as-built schedule. And I think sometimes not a lot of time is allocated or effort to really do a good as-built schedule, but I think that's so important for your the lay analysis ultimately. So yes, I think ultimately the type of schedules, what you have available, the completeness of that would determine your methodology.
Yeah, the better your schedules are, the more frequent the updates. It's just the more data you have, right? So with more data, you have more options, and those stronger methods are still on the table.
And I'll add to that, as an attorney, I love a good as-built on the back end. And as planned versus as built, they're easier to understand. They're easier to explain to a jury. And so as much as possible to have a good as built, I think will benefit you.
So what are some final tips and advice that you'd give to contractors who are either, again, just getting into the process of, integrating and, compiling schedules for projects, or, if you're a sophisticated contractor, what steps can you take to really implement, best practices for scheduling?
Yeah, I think firstly, the most important for me is ensure that you use your schedule as your project execution tool and not only as a device to monitor progress. So I think that's firstly the most important. Secondly, I think make sure that you update your schedule as things change. And I think we see many changes throughout the life cycle of a project, so you will have to update. And then maybe thirdly, when you initially compile your schedule, I think ensure that it is a interactive process where you have all the project participants together. And I think by doing that, from a scheduling perspective, that would be, I think, first prize in terms of doing good planning and following through until the end of your project with schedule updates and good planning initiatives.
Andrew, what is your soundbite takeaway as good advice for a contractor in terms of schedule maintenance or generation?
Just put in the effort now. It'll save you in the long run.
And Amanda, any key takeaways or advice you'd have for a client who might be coming to you and saying, what should I include in my contract with respect to scheduling, or what should I do now when I have an issue come up?
Just document, give notice. Make sure the owner is aware of every potential delay event, and know your contract terms.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today, and thanks again for all your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the Building Up podcast so you don't miss any insights with future guests.